Hi. As we continue on in the Psych of Aging course, we are still talking about social topics related to aging, social perception and cognition. These are two topics here that extend a little bit beyond some of the ideas related to our sense of self and narrowing social world that we've talked about previously. I have those defined right here on this slide. Social perception. What do we mean by that? What are we talking about? Well, when we observe other people, obviously we are perceiving them, right? But when we do so, we perceive a lot of things about other people, and in a social context, that's primarily going to try to involve our judgments about who they are and what they want, why are they doing the things that they might be doing. If they approach us and talk to us, we are immediately thinking to ourselves, what do they want from me, right? Why are they coming up to me? And of course, I hear their language and I'm thinking about are they sincere? Maybe a person just walking up to you on the street, they're trying to sell you something, perhaps, right? So in a situation like that, you're going to be thinking about, what is it that they're trying to sell me? Are they trying to sell me something? Are they asking me to donate something, right? And so you're trying to figure this out. So how do you do that? Well, it might come from certain things about the way that they move, right? Their gait, their speed of their movement, whether they're looking at you, making eye contact. Is it like too much eye contact sometimes, right? What's in their voice, right? Is their voice friendly, threatening? What's going on, right? So this is what we're trying to do, right? We're looking at their behavior, and listening to their language and just paying attention to the person, right? And that means we are trying to attribute and assign intentionality, right? That's intentions would be their purposes and what they're doing and why they're doing it. What's their emotional state? And then of course we can go further than that and we can talk about whether or not we can judge somebody to be trustworthy, or whether they're trying to deceive us. Are they lying to us? Can we detect when other people lie? This is, some people might claim to be better at this than others. Um, but whether or not we claim to be good at detecting lies is separate from whether we really are, of course. And of course, these become critical issues that are part of social perception, especially now if we think about aging, because all this stuff about deception is very much related to the risks for older adults when it comes to talking about fraud. Older adults are statistically more likely to fall victim to fraud and exploitation. Sometimes this occurs in face-to-face situations, people going around knocking on doors, trying to sell things, and they're not always kind of on the up and up. A lot more often these days, it's happening in digital interactions. Older adults are falling for various kinds of digital frauds, whether it's things that come through email, whether it's simulated messages that come through social media that make it seem like it's coming from a trustworthy person or even friend or family member. And so we need to be worried here about understanding how social perception works in general, and then also what's possibly changing as a function of age that might make it potentially harder for older adults to detect trustworthiness versus deception. I have a couple of risk factors here that we can sort of mention right off the bat because we talked about this in the previous chapter, loneliness, right? And so, to the extent that someone who is intent on deceiving or exploiting an older person does so under the auspices, is that a word? Of Under the auspice of kind of providing companionship and friendship, and they present themselves as a very friendly person, then that may appeal to a person who is otherwise maybe not getting the same amount of social interaction that they might prefer to have in their lives. And so they see this person as somebody that they might be able to befriend and trust. And so they're wanting that, right? And, it's worth bringing in the issues of cognitive and perceptual impairments that we've already covered in detail in previous chapters. But then we might ask, to what extent do these impact our social perception, right? So if visual ability is impaired, if auditory ability is impaired, does this affect my ability to determine from someone's facial expressions or tone of voice, their trustworthy levels, worthiness levels, right? Or what about cognitive impairments, things related to working memory capacity, attention, and inhibition, and so forth? Possibly some issues there as well. And then there's also, of course, simply just politeness norms. I can't speak today. Sorry. So one thing we have to ask is, why does this necessarily affect older adults more than it would people of any other age, right? We all assume that we're supposed to try to be polite to others, and being polite to others means that sometimes maybe you have an aversion to telling them, no, get away from me, right? So a random person comes up to you on the street and they're asking you for something, and if you're being polite, you might try to pause and give them attention and kind of acknowledge what they have to say and then try to respond in some, polite way. Or the alternative is we could say, no, what, leave me alone, and just keep on walking and ignore them. And so is it possible that as a function of age, one possibility is that it could simply be a cultural issue, a generational issue that um, people who are currently older adults, when they were younger, which was maybe 40, 50 more years ago, uh, they didn't encounter these kinds of social interactions. So it was considered to be more acceptable to just interact positively with strangers in certain environments. And so they're not used to having to tell people to blank off, right? So that could be part of it. It might be something else. It might be something related to some of the stuff related to stereotypes and stereotype threat that we've talked about in the previous chapter. Again, here that refers to the idea that if I'm concerned that because I'm older, someone might think of me as being kind of old and irritable and grumpy, then because of that, my concern over that perception, then maybe I'm going to maybe make overt attempts to be exactly the opposite of that, right? I don't want to be perceived as being the old grumpy man, right? So that could be another way in which this might manifest. Now, separate from social perception, if you want to say it's separate, is the issue of social cognition. So this relates to how we just generally conceive, right, conceptualize other people and their behavior. So we talk about mentalizing others. What we're doing here is we are saying that I understand that other people have minds, and that in their minds they have thoughts and feelings and needs and intentions and motivations and on, but I can't perceive those things, right? So that's not something that I could socially perceive necessarily. Right? I can see their behavior and make some judgments, but what I'm doing is that I'm trying to develop a mental picture of what's going on inside the mind of this other person that I'm interacting with. So that's what we mean when we talk about mentalizing others, is that I understand there's a rich mental life in this other person, and I don't really know most of what's going on in there, but we try to understand it. This is also what's referred to as theory of mind. This is an odd term. If you've had the regular development, I assume you must have had the regular development, lifespan development course, you might have talked about theory of mind in childhood, because there are these infamous theory of mind tasks that are given to children. Usually they start to pass them when they're about 4 years old. So we conclude that this is approximately the age that children really start to acquire this more advanced kind of social cognitive ability of mentalizing others. The kind of classic example of this is called the Sally Ann test. So I'll quickly explain it. So children are told a story about Sally playing with a toy, and so let's say it's like a toy, it's a ball, right? And so she's in a room in a house with another child named Anne, and Sally's playing with this ball, but then she places it in a box, and then she leaves the house and goes outside to play outside. And while she's outside, she can't see inside the house, but Anne takes the ball and takes it out of the box and puts it in a basket. So when Sally comes back, where will she look for her ball? And we understand that she would look in the box because that's where she left it. But a lot of younger kids, kids under the age of 4, will say that she will look in the basket because that's where it is. So what they have kind of failed to do here is separate their own knowledge of the events of the story that the ball has been relocated from Sally's access to that information. So they're not really effectively separating what they know and what Sally knows. And so in this case, they've attributed a false belief to Sally, right? And that shows their lack of theory of mind. So in this situation, we think that, okay, we acquire theory of mind in our childhood years. This plays an important role in the development of our social skills, the ability to really kind of put ourselves in other people's shoes, so to speak, and understand what they might be thinking. And so all of the content of our social cognitions, this includes our beliefs about other people, our general understanding, the kinds of attributions we make, the stereotypes, right? The things that relate to generalizations we make about others. These are all part of social cognition. Now, this thing about these theory of mind tests, like the Sally Ann test, so we might ask, does theory of mind decline, right? If it's acquired when we're 4 years old and kids start to pass these kinds of tests, would this possibly imply that the performance might decline as we get older? And if we gave these kinds of tests to older adults, would they start to fail them? No, they do not. So this would suggest that when it comes to this kind of a situation, uh, um, I don't think it's really fair to say that older adults' social cognitive abilities of that type are impaired at all because of their age, but it's maybe worth invoking against some of these cognitive changes, like working memory limitations, and especially when it comes to inhibiting irrelevant information that can then increase the load on working memory. And so this could suggest that in complex social scenarios where there's a lot of information to keep track of and remember, that increases the load on your working memory. And so if there is some impairment in your ability to filter out irrelevant, distracting information and manage working memory load, then this means that you're not going to track the information in these complex and fast-paced social interactions. And if that's a deception situation, that makes it more likely that the kind of classic kind of fast-talking scammer is more likely to be successful for someone who might have some degree of moderate uh, social cognitive impairment. So, okay, so few things that we can say here. I kind of previewed some of this already, so I won't necessarily linger all over it. But because social perception involves our actual ability to perceive visually, say, the way in which a person moves, then again, we could suggest that any visual impairments they have could impact this. And again, hearing tones of voice and other speech patterns that indicate trustworthiness or deception, any auditory impairments we have could definitely affect that. And again, like I just said, the classic fast talker who's a good manipulator might be able to achieve this by overloading someone's working memory, by saying things too fast for their reduced processing speed. So all of this is really going to kind of be a perceptual impact on the complexity of the situation. Another way I mentioned earlier also that the scams that older adults are more likely to fall victim to are happening more and more in digital situations. And one way to characterize this is to talk about mediated versus unmediated interactions. So an unmediated interaction is a face-to-face interaction. So we're face-to-face talking. I can hear your voice. I can see your face. I can see your body and the way you move, your posture, your body language, all these things. And so when it comes to picking up all of this relevant social perceptual information, it's going to be kind of working better in that kind of face-to-face situation. But again, the digital situations or even other forms that are mediated, so just receiving calls on the telephone, right? There's a lot of information that's missing when we reduce the interaction to just a voice over the phone. And certainly, of course, when it becomes more textual, when you get emails and text messages and direct messages in your social media accounts, all of these kinds of messages are more textual in nature. And certainly, of course, that means that not only is the visual perception of the other person missing, but so is the auditory tone of voice patterns, right? There's even a lot of younger people sometimes misperceive tone in a text message. They might misread something as being kind of aggressive or snarky when it's really just a lighthearted, sarcastic joke or something, right? So, but it seems like this might, in fact, be a more significant concern for older adults to misread uh, tone and so forth, and deceptive intent, perhaps, in these kinds of mediated interactions. Now, what we're really skirting the issue here that we kind of need to get to is the concept of attribution theory. So, all of that discussion of social perception and social cognition centers on the idea that when we are interacting with another person, what we are sort of implicitly doing, sometimes maybe even explicitly doing, is we are making attributions about that other person, right? And that means that I'm trying to understand why are they doing what they're doing, and is their behavior a function of their personality? Is it just the kind of person that they are? Or is their behavior a function of their situation, their environment? And that's just the situation that they are in. So we would define these two things respectively as either internal or external attributions, right? An internal attribution, also called a dispositional attribution, is I am appealing to something inside that person to explain their behavior, right? So my quote here, they're doing this, whatever it might be, because that's the kind of person they are, right? I've internalized that behavior into them, right? The external or situational attribution is, again, it's that more situational level of this is the environment that they are in. So just as one quick example, maybe I have observed somebody, let's say I've kind of change the subject away from aging. Let's talk about children. Let's say that we see a child tell a lie to their parents about something, and we could make an internal attribution and say, assuming we know that they've told the lie, so we think, oh, that little liar, right? So we're thinking that the child is developing this kind of character or disposition that makes them lie a lot, right? So we start to think they're a little fraudster in training or something like that. But we also know that sometimes kids just, are afraid of getting in trouble, and they're embarrassed. And so they might lie because of those reasons, right? It's not because they're a bad person and they're liars inherently or anything, but it's just that situation of being afraid or being embarrassed, ashamed, and so forth. That could be the reason for it. So in this case, we would appeal to some other kind of external kind of excuse for their behavior, right? So, but we do this a lot, right? For all of our social interactions, we kind of develop, usually, like I said, it's kind of implicit. We don't sit around and kind of deliberate over these things, but we just make these kind of quick, intuitive snap judgments about who people are and why they do what they do. And sometimes it's more personal and sometimes it's more situational. Well, as it turns out, when we do these things, this is a well-known phenomenon in social psychology called the fundamental attribution error, which is we tend to default to making internal attributions about others, right? So even though we might sometimes excuse away people's behavior on their situation, research tells us over and over again that a very common trend amongst all humans of all ages is to have a tendency to default towards making the internal attribution. Right? This is just something for all ages, right? But it might be the case that this becomes less likely to occur as we age, right? So that's interesting. So what's going on here? Well, we might say, since this term is called the fundamental attribution error, what do we mean? Why is it an error to make an internal attribution? And well, the one possible reason is that maybe we are kind of overestimating to the extent to which someone's actions can always be explained by their disposition, and that people really do oftentimes kind of react to their environment and react to their situation. And so it could be the case here that if older adults are less prone to this, then that means that if we treat this as a judgment bias of sorts, and we talked about judgment biases and some of the cognitive stuff, right? Talking about the availability bias and confirmation bias and these other kinds of things. And we compared it to wisdom and intelligence and post-formal thinking. And the idea is that maybe what's happening is that older adults are starting to become a little bit better at making these kinds of judgments about others, that where you're better able to take into account somebody's environment and somebody's situation, right? Because maybe you've become a little bit of a life expert, a little bit. That's one of the ways that we can consider the idea of wisdom. So it might be in this case that sounds like an advantage for older adults and their social abilities, because now we're suggesting that they're going to do a better job of understanding why people do the things that they do. They're going to not necessarily have a tendency to make a lot of judgments about others. So that creates a sense of non-judgmentalness about others that could in fact be quite good, at least when it comes to when those other people really do have good intentions. Then we're more likely to see them in a positive light. And we're more likely to kind of forgive any negative things that they have done, right? So if there's a person that I have seen who maybe did something bad, maybe it was like I said, told a lie or something, an older adult might be more likely to say, I can overlook that little mistake that they made. I'm not going to use that as a way of condemning them as a person, because I know that was probably just a tough situation they found themselves in, right? So, and contrast that with the idea of defaulting towards the internal attribution, where if we do fall victim to the fundamental attribution error, we might be more likely to say they're pretty suspicious, right? Um, so in this way, what we're doing is we're prioritizing more positive emotional interpretations, which is an idea that's consistent with something else we've covered before, the socio-emotional selectivity theory, which, if you recall, when we talked about that under the heading of attention, it suggested that we are putting more attention on environmental stimuli that have an emotional component to them. So that means that maybe we're a little more likely here to notice relevant features of a person's environment that might influence their behavior, like this. So that means that in some ways older adults are more forgiving, and that could be a good thing. But at the same time, it might also mean that when the person's intentions are not actually good, then it might make them a little more prone towards being victimized, right? Fake sincerity is more likely to be convincing in that situation here. So now what this would suggest is that this kind of shift towards a more positive situational attributions might increase people's feelings of trust. And now we need to ask the question, what are the factors that influence our tendency to trust other people or to not trust other people? There's a lot of terminology on this. There's trust versus what is called distrust, right? Where I'm not trusting somebody at all. There's also something called mistrust. And what is mistrust? So mistrust is what occurs when I fail to trust something that I maybe should trust, right? So I said something, I should say someone, but kind of defaulting in the back of my head is I work in human factor psychology. So a lot of times we talk about trust in technologies that we use. So, typical example I always use there is to talk about your car, right? You kind of have to trust your car to get you where you're going, right? You got to get to work every day, maybe, or you got to get to school every day, and you need to trust that your car's going to start so you can get to work on time. And of course, if your car is reliable and you trust it, then of course you are exhibiting normal trust. If your car is reliable, but for some reason you are not trusting it, you're always worried that it's going to fail, you are mistrusting it, right? You should be trusting it a little bit more than you are. In contrast, there is distrust, and distrust is a situation where maybe your lack of trust is valid, right? That your car is in fact kind of breaking down, and so your distrust is valid. And now that's going to also maybe set us up for then the idea of overtrust. So let's say that your car is breaking down, but you still trust it. You're not really paying attention to some of the quirks and things that are happening with it, so you are trusting it more than it deserves, and that's overtrust. And if we connect this back to people, right, it might be that if we have this tendency towards making more positive and situational attributions, this could lead to more overtrust, right? It might just mean that there's this default tendency now to trust rather than to not trust. And again, it connects perhaps a lot to the socio-emotional selectivity theory. Another thing we need to consider is that let's say you start by meeting a new person and you have to make some kind of attribution about them and decide whether to trust them or not. But over time, the more you interact with them, the more you're going to have new information about this person. And that might mean that you need to start to possibly change your mind about this person. So we call this thing, we use terms here like attributional updating, right? So I initially made this attribution about this person, but based on new information, I have to update and change some of those, or belief revision, right? And part of the issue here is that this requires what is sometimes referred to as type 2 cognition, that very slow, deliberative kind of cognition, compared to type 1, which is more fast and automatic and unthinking. And so to the extent that, again, that there's some issues with working memory load and attentional capacity and inhibiting distracting information, then it might be a lot harder for older adults to engage in attributional updating and calibrating their trust over time. That's a good phrase for it, right? Is your initial sense of trust in another person may or may not be exactly accurate, but over time, the more you interact with them, the more you ought to be able to calibrate that trust, right? To get it closer to being exactly where it needs to be, not overtrusting, not mistrusting or anything. It's going to be more accurate. But that means, of course, whenever disconfirming evidence arises, right, something that contradicts what I previously believed, I have to notice the disconfirming evidence, and then I have to also use that to update my pre-existing beliefs. And so this can be something that takes a little longer, a little more challenging for older adults. And that means the first impression has a bigger impact on older adults. That's another classic bias here, that everyone kind of tends to put more emphasis on your first impression, but it seems to be maybe a stronger effect for older adults here. And again, once we introduce the issue of cognitive load, fast-paced conversations and mediated conversations that are more demanding, then again, we might more likely fall victim to instead of using disconfirming evidence, we're going to only notice the things that confirm our beliefs. So maybe a stronger confirmation bias happening there in those kinds of situations. So this all, you put all this together and we can start to maybe put a little bit of a picture together for why older adults are maybe more likely to fall for various scams. And as I had already noticed, kind of appealing to someone's loneliness, it is a very common theme you see in a lot of scams for relationship formations, right? This happens a lot on social media, that people create a fake profile on social media of a kind of like maybe like a young attractive person, and they do these kind of phishing scams, catfishing scams and so forth, where they try to create a relationship with somebody and make them feel like they are wanted and part of a relationship with this person now, and then they take advantage of that. So that kind of need for companionship is kind of an important thing here. Another thing to think about here when it comes to older adults and the fraud and victimization business is what happens when they do fall for these things, right? So a lot of these times, especially the financial ones, let's say that somebody falls victim for a scam in which somebody maybe it's one of these relationship scams, a catfishing scam, and your your fake virtual girlfriend asks you for money for something, right? And you start to believe, okay, she's a real person and she really likes me, and I'm gonna send her $500 because of whatever emergency she's described to me in a text message, and so we do that, but then what happens is maybe we start to question, we start to think, is this a scam? and I start to worry about whether it's a scam. But one of the things is that rather than going to get assistance and to help to maybe tell some trusted friends or family members or even people at the bank where I'm going to get this money and so forth, what you'll see often is that older adults will hide this scam and they won't tell anyone about it. And and instead of cutting that person off and blocking them, they will keep on doing it, right? They will give them more money again and again and again, even if in the back of their mind they might be worried that it's a scam. So why is this happening? Well, there's lots of reasons for this, and one could be kind of a classic social psych finding called cognitive dissonance. Right? What happens is that no one wants to believe that they are easily victimized. Right? No one wants to think that I'm the kind of person who could be so easily fooled that this person who I thought was really into me and sending me all these messages on Facebook or whatever. Is really a scam. So I have now dissonant beliefs here, dissonant cognitions. One is I see myself as a savvy person who knows when someone's lying to me, versus two, I'm worried this person might have actually just scammed me. So how do I reduce the dissonance? And one way is to change one of these cognitions. Well, it's unlikely I'm going to change the first cognition. We talked about that with identity accommodation earlier. Not always going to happen. So here what we're going to do is change the second cognition. We're going to say that that person is not scamming me, and I can convince myself and rationalize this. That helps me resolve the dissonance here at this point, right? So I'm going to persist perhaps now in buying into this. And of course, hiding it from others helps protect myself from the dissonance. Because if the other people are going to start saying, hey, that's a scam, and they're going to argue with me about it, that just increases my dissonance. So by shielding myself from hearing that message and getting that feedback, it minimizes the dissonance. Of course, part of that relates to the self-esteem, because I just talked about the identity accommodation business where we start to change our self-beliefs and start to say, okay, if I acknowledge that I was scammed, then that means I have to acknowledge that I'm not nearly as savvy as I thought I was. And now this is going to really have a big impact on my self-esteem and on my self-concept. So to protect myself there, I'm going to again insist that it's not a scam and keep on going with it. Also, it might as well be the case that trust is something that is treated as something that's very valuable, that I think it is moral to trust other people. And I don't want to see myself as the kind of person who defaults towards mistrust or distrust around others all the time. That feels like a negative way to interact with others. So I see that there's greater moral value in being more trustworthy and trusting. So therefore, maybe that's another factor. The last one, again, is stereotype threat. So if I perceive that there is a stereotype about me as an older person, that I am the kind of person who's more likely to fall for a scam, then this makes me really worried about how people judge me. And if I have potentially fallen victim to a scam, now I feel threatened by conforming to the stereotype. So I'm going to insist that I am not the victim of a scam, and therefore I'm not conforming to the stereotype, right? So there's all of these reasons and lots of more are going to be situations where you see older adults kind of hide these things from their confidants and sometimes persist in sending more and more money to scammers. It's a particularly problematic kind of situation. Okay, well, now I think we are done with that chapter. That was a quick one, relatively, anyway. So that's it for that chapter, and then I'll see you in the next one.